There's a rivalry inside the Army that never really goes away, no matter how many deployments pass. Active Army versus the Army National Guard. Same uniform, same flag, very different worlds. Active duty soldiers will tell you they're the real soldiers because they live it full time. Federal mission, constant readiness, uniform on 40, 50, sometimes 60 hours a week. The Army isn't something they do, it's who they are. Guard soldiers live a different reality. Dual state and federal mission. Civilian careers layered on top of military obligations. Surge training instead of constant training. Switching identities constantly while still being expected to perform. That mismatch alone creates tension because both sides think the other doesn't fully understand the job.
Being full-time doesn't automatically make you better. It just means the system kept you busy.
I do, because I lived both. I was active duty. I went to war on active duty. I was Army National Guard. I deployed into combat with the Guard. 20 years as a combat medic.
Active hides behind hours. Guard hides behind hardship. Neither replaces standards.
At the same time, I worked civilian side as a registered nurse, then became a nurse practitioner, while still serving as an enlisted medic in the Guard. So when I say this next part, it's not theory, it's experience. The biggest lie in this rivalry is the idea that hours in uniform equal competence. Active duty soldiers love to compare hours. I'm in uniform 40 to 60 hours a week. They're in uniform a few days a month. On paper, that sounds logical. In reality, it's a false equivalency, because most hours in uniform are not training. They're formations, waiting, motor pool layouts, inventories, mandatory briefings, online training, details, administrative churn, taskings that have nothing to do with combat or real-world performance. Being present is not the same as getting better.
If you only train when ordered, don't pretend the weekend makes you elite.
I've watched active duty soldiers spend years full-time in uniform without getting meaningful repetitions under stress. That's not a personal failure. That's a systems reality. The Guard is different, not easier. Guard time is shorter, but it's compressed and purpose-driven. Drill weekends pack weapons, medical, maintenance, evaluations, and mission planning into brutally tight windows. That forces efficiency. It forces individual responsibility. It forces people to show up already knowing their job. And when Guard units mobilize, the part-time myth dies immediately. They train continuously. They deploy. They bleed. I've treated casualties on both sides of this argument. Combat doesn't care how you trained stateside. Combat cares whether you can perform. And I saw this rivalry play out in real time during a 68 Whiskey Medic conversion course at Fort Knox. Active duty, Guard, and reserve were all in the same training pipeline. Same standards, same curriculum, same instructors, and you could feel the tribalism the second you walked into the classroom. Active Army sat in one section of the room. The Guard sat in another. The reserves had their own corner. Same Army, 3 different camps. On the civilian side, I was already working as a nurse practitioner in urgent care and primary care. But in that room, none of that mattered. What mattered was what people thought your uniform said about you. We had to introduce ourselves. And when it came to my turn, I stood up as an enlisted medic wearing a United States Army Special Operations Command combat patch from my active duty time in the 160th. I had enlisted crew member wings because I'd been a flight medic. I had jump wings from jumping with that unit. I had the combat medical badge, second award. You could feel the tension. And one of the active duty medics made a comment loud enough for the room to hear. He said, "All that badge means is you got lucky, twice." Now, I'm not thin-skinned. I can take a joke. But that wasn't a joke. That was insecurity wearing a uniform. So I looked back at him and said calmly, "Okay, then what about the expert field medical badge? Is that luck too?" And the room went quiet, because that's what this rivalry really looks like when it's stripped bare. People dismiss experience they don't have by calling it luck. They shrink stories that make them uncomfortable, and it didn't help that I didn't fit the stereotype they wanted. Some days I showed up to class in my classic red Corvette. Other days I rolled in with my oversized 4-door pickup truck. So now I wasn't just Guard, I was that guy. And that's the real lesson. This rivalry isn't always about competence. It's about identity. It's about ego. It's about resentment. People don't argue standards. They argue status. And that ugliness got worse during the global war on terror. Guard units deployed constantly. Same missions, same risk, same casualties. Active units sometimes felt guard units slowed rotations or needed extra oversight. Guard soldiers often felt treated like second-class citizens despite doing the same job. Nothing fuels resentment faster than shared danger combined with perceived disrespect. Culture makes it worse. Active Army culture is rank-heavy and rigid. Soldier first always. Guard culture is more informal. Competence often matters more than polish. Citizen first, soldier always. Each side caricatures the other. Active calls guard weekend warriors. Guard calls active rigid careerists. Both are lazy. Both miss the truth. The Army's real problem isn't component. It's variance, leadership, standards enforcement, repetition quality. And once you accept that truth, the next question is unavoidable. If the problem is not active versus guard, if the problem is systems, incentives, and standards, then we need to stop arguing identity and start fixing structure. And this is the part that's going to piss people off. Let me be very clear about something before we talk about standards, structure, or efficiency. If a nation cannot properly pay the people it sends into harm's way, everything else is just noise.
You can't call it sacrifice when families are choosing which bills to pay.
Right now, active duty and National Guard military families qualify for food assistance. That is not a budgeting problem. That is a moral failure. So the first reform is simple. Double military base pay across the board, from private to 4-star general, for active duty and National Guard. Not bonuses, not temporary incentives. Base pay. We demand unlimited liability, constant relocation, family separation, and lifelong physical and mental wear, and then act surprised when people struggle financially. That is unacceptable. And no, officers are not paid enough.
Anyone who says military officers are paid enough has never carried responsibility that follows you home.
A mid-career officer managing millions of dollars in equipment and responsible for hundreds of people often earns less than a civilian project manager or hospital administrator with a fraction of that responsibility. In the civilian world, those people negotiate contracts, collect bonuses, and walk away from bad jobs. Officers do not get that option. They get duty, and duty does not pay the mortgage. Proper pay is not charity. It is national security. Now let's talk about what happens after pay is fixed, because compensation without reform just preserves broken systems. Starting at E5, service members who are satisfied with the duty and responsibility of their position should be allowed to stay there by choice without financial punishment.
Tuck it higher in the pocket. There you go. Elbow down just a touch. Yeah, like that. Keep the wrist straight. Don't torque. Some of the best soldiers didn't want more rank. They wanted to be excellent.
Roger, Sergeant.
Let that be you. Press it smooth when you're ready.
Right now, the system forces people to promote whether they want the added responsibility or not. That is how you get reluctant leaders, burned out non-commissioned officers, and promotions driven by survival instead of competence. There are E5s who are exceptional at their jobs. They train junior troops. They enforce standards. They are trusted by everyone in the unit. They do not want platoon-level administrative burden. They want to do the job well. A career E5 should be compensated through an in-grade pay scale. Step increases based on time in service, performance, certifications, and operational value. This already exists in civilian trades, aviation, engineering, and medicine. We pay mastery, not just ambition. The military should too. Next comes physical standards. There should be one baseline physical fitness standard for everyone who wears the uniform. Not elite, not special operations, baseline competence. If you are in the military, you should be able to ruck 12 miles with a 50-pound ruck, perform 10 strict pull-ups, complete a defined number of strict push-ups, and run 1 mile within a set time. This is not an elite standard. This is the minimum requirement to not be a liability when something goes wrong.
This isn't elite. This is not being the weak link.
You do not get to choose when a base is attacked, when evacuation fails, or when you have to move under load. One standard restores credibility, simplifies testing, and eliminates endless exceptions. Yes, some people will fail. That is not cruelty, that is honesty. Now let's talk about structure. The military maintains multiple reserve components that duplicate missions already performed by the National Guard. In real life, when hurricanes hit, wildfires spread, floods destroy infrastructure, or civil emergencies overwhelm local resources, it is the National Guard that responds. When overseas deployments surge and active duty units are stretched thin, it is the National Guard that fills the gap. There is no operational justification for separate reserve forces.
If one force already responds, deploys, and bleeds, why are we paying for 3 systems?
All reserve forces should be consolidated under the National Guard. One reserve force, one command structure, one readiness and training pipeline. National Guard units should have clear identity, 2 letters for the state followed by the branch. Texas Army Guard, Florida Air Guard, California Naval Guard.
It shouldn't say U.S. Army. It should say Kentucky Army Guard. That's the premise. It's who we are, and it matters.
Clear identity creates clear accountability for governors, federal leadership, and service members. Now comes the emotional argument. Some of this is hard to hear because people wrap identity around structure. But identity is not the same thing as effectiveness. The Marine Corps does not need to exist as a separate branch. Its combat capability is real, but its bureaucracy is redundant. In real operations, Marines deploy alongside Army units, use the same logistics systems, and operate under joint command structures.
You notice anything out here look different between us and them?
Just the patches they wouldn't let us wear.
Right. Keeping the Marine Corps separate is about branding, not battlefield advantage.
The solution is consolidation. Marine combat forces integrate into the Army for active duty missions and into the National Guard for reserve and domestic missions.
Fold the Marines into the Army and Guard. The fighters stay. The bureaucracy dies.
Marine standards and culture remain. Redundant headquarters do not. Administrative bloat must also be addressed. Every unit does not need its own pay clerks, personnel shop, and administrative specialists. This system creates delayed pay, lost records, missed promotions, and constant frustration for service members and families.
We don't need more clerks. We need more training.
Administrative roles should be regionally consolidated into centralized hubs handling pay, personnel, benefits, promotions, and records. Centralization is not about saving money. It is about fixing pay faster, correcting records faster, and keeping units focused on training instead of paperwork. Ask the honest question. How many hundreds or thousands of administrative specialists do we really need in the age of modern digital systems? Far fewer than we have now. The same applies to identical jobs across branches. A medic is a medic. Trauma does not change based on uniform color. There should be one core medic training pipeline, one certification standard, and branch-specific follow-on only where absolutely required. The same consolidation should apply to logistics, intelligence, communications, cyber operations, and maintenance specialties. The National Guard also needs training that reflects the mission it actually performs. Guard members respond to disasters, infrastructure failures, and civil emergencies.
If the Guard already deploys, fights, and responds, what exactly are the reserves protecting?
Guess we'll find out.
Their basic training should be extended to include state mission authorities, disaster response, and interagency coordination, alongside standard military training. That strengthens real-world readiness. Finally, we need to be honest about civilian positions. With modern computing and artificial intelligence, some civilian defense roles are obsolete. Not threatened, obsolete. Redundant civilian positions should be consolidated or eliminated, not to punish workers, but to fund readiness.
When soldiers and civilians do the same paperwork, one of those jobs shouldn't exist.
And properly pay service members. And now the part that needs to be said plainly. If this hurts your feelings, you are in the wrong profession. The military is not built around comfort, validation, or identity protection. It exists to win, to respond, and to function under pressure. Standards are not personal attacks. Reform is not disrespect. Reality does not care how anyone feels about it. These reforms are not about shrinking the military. They are about paying people properly, cutting waste, restoring standards, and rebuilding credibility. If this conversation makes people uncomfortable, that is fine. Discomfort is how broken systems finally change. I've seen exceptional active units and terrible ones. I've seen exceptional guard units and terrible ones. The uniform doesn't decide that. Money pours gasoline on the fire. State Guard incentives, sometimes labeled 1776 bonuses, exist to retain soldiers in high-demand roles. They're state-funded. Active duty isn't eligible. To active soldiers, it looks like part-time service getting paid more. That perception matters more than the math. Then in late 2020, Congress authorized a one-time $1776 payment to active duty service members. Guard and Reserve didn't receive it unless they were on qualifying active duty orders. Legally, it was status-based. Emotionally, it felt like same risk, same mission, different paycheck. Both reactions were understandable. None of it had anything to do with combat value. Then comes the ugliest line of all. We're real soldiers. The Guard isn't. That belief usually comes from identity protection. Active soldiers live under full-time uniform code of military justice, permanent change of station moves, daily formations, no real separation between army time and personal time. So, when they see someone who can go home after drill and still wear the same uniform, it feels threatening. That's not logic. That's ego armor. Lower enlisted and junior non-commissioned officers push this hardest, especially those who've never been in combat. They compare hours in uniform because it's the only metric they have, but combat erases that argument in about 5 minutes. Rounds don't check component. Explosions don't respect drill status. Casualties don't differentiate pay systems. Under fire, nobody asks if you're active or guard. They ask one thing: can you do your job? Guard soldiers are right when they say this, if they say it correctly. We're held to the same standard, expected to perform the same mission, but we have less time to get there. That's not arrogance, that's math. Where it fails is when it turns into superiority. Active soldiers are also right when they say daily repetition builds muscle memory. This isn't a moral argument, it's a systems argument. The real question isn't how many hours you spend in uniform, it's how many meaningful repetitions you get. Reps under stress, reps with consequences, reps that build judgment. I've lived this from both sides. Active and guard, combat on both, medicine on both, civilian emergency care, and military trauma side by side. And here's the only answer that survives reality. Real soldiers aren't defined by component, pay status, or hours in uniform. They're defined by performance when it matters. Everything else is noise. This is survival. This is resilience. This is suburban prepper.